If you want to understand the modern Middle East, the fractured borders, the bitter rivalries, the century of unrest, do not look to the deserts of Arabia. Look instead to the freezing, mud-soaked mountain passes of Bulgaria and Macedonia in the autumn of 1912. It was there, in a war most of the world has forgotten, that a 600-year-old empire was utterly humiliated. The army that shouldn't have lost, did. And in the trauma of that defeat, a group of young, desperate officers made a fateful decision. They abandoned the dream of a diverse, multi-ethnic empire and embraced a radical, militant nationalism. The echoes of the artillery fired in the First Balkan War did not just shatter Ottoman Europe. They tore apart the fabric of the Islamic world, drew the modern borders of the Middle East, and planted the seeds for conflicts that still burn today. To understand how an empire falls, we first have to understand what was keeping it together. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a sprawling, dizzying mosaic. From the cafes of the Balkans to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, it encompassed a vast array of languages, religions, and ethnicities. For centuries, the glue holding this all together was the Sultan, who also held the title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of the global Muslim community. Under the umbrella of the Caliphate, Arabs, Turks, Kurds, and Albanians were united by faith, while Christian and Jewish subjects lived under a complex system of semi-autonomous rule. But by 1908, the empire was dying. It was financially bankrupt, technologically stagnant, and constantly bullied by European empires who mockingly called it the sick man of Europe. Enter the Young Turks. They were a coalition of reform-minded military officers and intellectuals who believed that the only way to save the empire was to modernize it. In July 1908, they staged a revolution, forcing the tyrannical Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution. For a brief shining moment, an intoxicating wave of optimism swept through the empire. In the streets of Constantinople, Salonika, and Damascus, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, and Greeks embraced each other. The Young Turks promised a new ideology, Ottomanism. It was the dream that regardless of your race or religion, you were an equal citizen of the Ottoman state. The empire would be saved not by the sword, but by unity. It was a beautiful dream. It lasted exactly 4 years. The illusion of unity began to crack almost immediately, but it was entirely shattered in October 1912. The empire's former subjects in the Balkans, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro, looked at the chaotic, reforming Ottoman state and saw an opportunity. They formed the Balkan League, set aside their own bitter rivalries, and launched a massive coordinated invasion. The Ottoman High Command was completely caught off guard. They believed the Balkan states would never unite, and they believed their newly reformed army could easily crush any rebellion. They were wrong on both counts. What followed was not just a military defeat, it was a total collapse. In a matter of weeks, the Ottoman armies in Europe disintegrated. Logistics failed, soldiers went days without food, freezing in the autumn rain. Ammunition ran out. At the battles of Kirk Kilise and Kumanovo, the Ottoman forces were routed, sent fleeing in panic toward the capital. Within a month, the Bulgarians were at the very gates of Constantinople, close enough that the residents of the city could hear the roar of their artillery. Centuries of Ottoman history were erased in days. Cities that had been the crown jewels of the empire for half a millennium, Salonika, Monastir, Uskub, were gone. But it wasn't just the loss of territory that broke the empire. It was the human cost. As the Ottoman armies retreated, they were followed by a tidal wave of human misery. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, known as the Muhajir, fled the advancing Balkan armies. They poured into Constantinople, bringing with them horrific tales of massacres, burned villages, and ethnic cleansing. The mosques and courtyards of the capital overflowed with starving, freezing, traumatized refugees. For the Ottoman leadership and the Turkish public, this was an apocalyptic shock. Rumelia, the European heartland of the empire, the birthplace of many of its greatest generals and viziers, was severed forever. This is the exact moment the trajectory of the 20th century shifts. The trauma of 1912 triggered a fatal psychological snap within the Young Turk leadership. The moderate politicians in the government were paralyzed by the disaster, desperately trying to negotiate a humiliating peace. But within the military ranks, a dark, furious paranoia took hold. The dream of Ottomanism died in the refugee camps of Constantinople. How could they believe in a brotherhood of all citizens when their Christian neighbors had just driven them into the sea? On January 23, 1913, that fury exploded into action. A young, charismatic, and ruthlessly ambitious officer named Enver Bey led a small detachment of armed men in a daring raid on the Sublime Porte, the center of the Ottoman government. Bursting into the cabinet room, Enver and his men assassinated the Minister of War and forced the Grand Vizier to resign at gunpoint. It was a violent, decisive coup d'etat. Power now rested in the hands of a radical faction of the Young Turks, led by a triumvirate that would become known as the Three Pashas, Enver, Talaat, and Jamal. They were hard men, forged in the humiliation of defeat, and they were determined to save what was left of the empire by any means necessary. But their vision for salvation had fundamentally changed. Ottomanism was dead. If the Christians of the Balkans had carved out their own ethno-nationalist states, the Three Pashas believed the empire must do the same. They replaced the inclusive dream of Ottomanism with a rigid, aggressive ideology: Turkification. The empire would no longer be a diverse mosaic. It would be a Turkish state for the Turkish people, dominated by Turkish language and culture. It was a pivot born of desperation, but its consequences would be catastrophic, because while the empire had lost Europe, it still held massive territories in the Middle East, and millions of the people living there were not Turks, they were Arabs. For centuries, Arab loyalty to the Ottoman Empire had been rooted in religion. The Sultan was the Caliph, the defender of the faith. But as the Three Pashas centralized power and began aggressively pushing Turkish language and culture into the Arab provinces of Syria, Iraq, and the Hejaz, that bond began to break. Arab elites, intellectuals, and military officers who had initially supported the Young Turk Revolution now found themselves marginalized. They were no longer equal citizens of an Islamic empire. They were subjects of a Turkish nationalist state. You can draw a straight line from the shock of the Balkan Wars to the alienation of the Arab world. By shifting the empire's foundation from religion to race, the Young Turks inadvertently awakened Arab nationalism. Secret societies began forming in Damascus and Beirut, whispering about autonomy and eventually independence. The stage was set. The powder keg was packed. It only needed a spark. That spark came just 1 year later, in the summer of 1914. Desperate to reclaim the empire's lost glory and terrified of being carved up by European powers, Enver Pasha made the fatal decision to ally with Imperial Germany and plunge the fragile Ottoman state into the bloodbath of the First World War. The war accelerated everything the Balkan disaster had set in motion. As the empire fought for its survival against the British and the Russians, the paranoia of the Three Pashas reached horrific new heights. Viewing their non-Turkish populations as existential threats, they orchestrated the systematic deportation and extermination of the Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, a genocide born from the same trauma and extreme nationalism forged in 1912. Meanwhile, in the Arab provinces, the alienation turned into open rebellion. The British, sensing the fatal crack between the Turks and the Arabs, exploited it brilliantly. They reached out to Sharif Hussein, the Arab leader of Mecca, promising him an independent Arab kingdom in exchange for a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Fueled by years of resentment against the Young Turks' policies of Turkification, the Arabs rose up. The Arab Revolt, famously aided by T.E. Lawrence, tore through the Hejaz and the Levant, shattering the last remnants of Ottoman authority in the Middle East. But the Arabs too were betrayed. The British and the French had already secretly agreed to carve up the Middle East for themselves in the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. When the dust of World War I finally settled, the Ottoman Empire was entirely erased from the map. The Caliphate, the institution that had united the region for centuries, was soon abolished. In its place, European diplomats sat in quiet rooms and drew arbitrary lines across the map of the Middle East. They created new nations: Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, ignoring the complex realities of the people living there. They grouped rival factions together and divided ancient communities apart, ensuring a century of instability. The modern Middle East was born in betrayal and drawn by imperial ambition. But the conditions that allowed it to happen, the collapse of Ottoman authority, the rise of rigid nationalism, the fracturing of Islamic unity, were not born in the sands of Arabia. They were born in the freezing mud of the Balkans in 1912. If the Ottoman army had held the line in Thrace, if the millions of refugees had never flooded Constantinople, if Enver Pasha had never stormed the Sublime Porte with a pistol in his hand, the radicalization of the empire might never have happened. The fragile bonds between Turk and Arab might have survived. The map of the Middle East would look entirely different today. History is rarely a series of isolated events. It is a chain reaction. A single artillery shell fired in Bulgaria can trigger a political coup in Istanbul, which alienates a scholar in Damascus, which starts a rebellion in Mecca, which leads to borders drawn in London, which bleed in the Middle East 100 years later. The echoes of that decision, forged in the panic of defeat, would shape the next 500 years of history. If you enjoy tracing the hidden threads of history and uncovering the forgotten chapters that built our modern world, subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments which historical turning point you want us to explore next. Until next time, keep looking back.